Hey guys, Hashi here. Today I wanted to talk about some lore that may make some people upset. To some people, the notion that lore can make some people upset may come as a shock, and to others, they may guess what I'm going to be covering today. Well, today we are covering the creation myth for Warhammer as a whole. And when I say Warhammer as a whole, I mean 40k, Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, and maybe even Blood Bowl. The point of today's video is not to be some comprehensive lore summary, but rather to make commentary on the weird double standard parts of the community have about lore, where people say they are huge lore nerds, but then actively spread misinformation about certain things being intentionally mysterious and therefore unknowable. This philosophy does make this video pretty intimidating to produce, especially since I know that some folks at GW watch my videos. Hello, Alex. And this might be their first exposure to some of this lore. I don't intend to sound egotistical when I say this, but I genuinely don't think that half of the esoteric information I will be bringing up in this video is common knowledge even amongst the writing staff. I think the details line up very well, sure, but I doubt most of this is laid out in some design document everybody reads before writing a book. This segues into the first point I want to get into, that being authorial intent. I'm covering this first because what I just said about design documents, and I know some folks who really love to obfuscate lore are going to smugly respond to this video with some permutation of, but the author intended. So to be blunt, if your one retort is, but we know that's not intentional, I really don't care. I care about what is in the text and what is consistent, not what was allegedly supposed to be there. As I alluded to in my canon video, I just flat out don't care what the author has to say outside of the text. With that out of the way, we can get into the video proper. As I said earlier, the controversial lore I want to go into today is the creation myth for the Warhammer Mythos. This means we are going to be dispelling the obfuscation around the antics of the old ones prior to Warhammer 40,000. I'm going to restate that while I'm covering quite a bit of lore here, this is not some comprehensive documentation. There is bound to be stuff I miss, just because how esoteric some of this stuff is, and because how much the community likes that this stuff is obscure and won't talk about it. If there's something in some random Bretonnian novel, I wouldn't know, because why would I read a Bretonnian novel for some cosmology stuff? Also, some of the fantasy lore does just genuinely put me to sleep. Like, it's mudcore, it's kind of boring, if I'm going to be real with y'all for a second. Here we have the quote that starts it all in multiple ways. This quote is from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. The book is called Realms of Sorcery, and in it we are told, in the moments before the beginning, there was no time, no matter, and no dimension, only the endless potential for these things. For in the absence of absolutely everything, absolutely anything becomes possible. And so it was that this endless potential realized its own existence, thus creating the universe and all the planes of existence that run parallel to it. As time, matter, and dimension swelled in the physical womb of the realized, the potential continued to grow alongside them within the metaphysical womb of the still unrealized. Every new creation brought with it the possibility for growth and a greater complexity of form and process. In time, creation realized unto itself life, and the life in turn spawned perception, and following perception came consciousness, and with consciousness so followed intelligence, and from intelligence sprang conception. And from that came the words that bind all things into conception. And so the words made new conceptions, and the new conceptions increased intelligence, and increased intelligence broadened consciousness, and broadened consciousness deepened perception. And this deepened perception came to know life more fully, and perception understood the form and process of all that was realized, and came to permeate the raw potential of all that was yet unrealized. Within the endless potential of the unrealized, conceptions began to take their own form, and in time the great paradigms awakened, powers of the unrealized that spoke their own words, so glorious and so terrible. Now millennia have passed, and we speak our own words, words that marry the tongues of the mundane with the tongues of those whose mystical insight teaches us of the gods and the world, of the mortal and the immortal, and with them we may sculpt the world to our own will, and the universe to our design. So it is, and so it shall be. I should note that the Warhammer fandom wiki has had this on their timeline page for Warhammer Fantasy. Well, Lexiconum still doesn't, so I guess that's a 1-0 for fandom. Although this quote only appeared after April 13th, 2021, which was after I already posted this quote on my blog. So I'm still winning, like usual. Anyways, the start of the quote, where we were told about in the moments before the beginning there was no time, no matter, no dimension, etc., We are being told that before time, which would be around the same quote-unquote time as where this old run from the Lustria supplement from 4E Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is chilling, I guess. They don't really elaborate on what he's doing at the beginning of time. During this period, there's no time, matter, or dimensions, only the potential for these things. So because of this absence, anything became possible, so this endless potential realized it exists. By doing this, the universe was made, and all the other planes of existence were made. This made many people very angry, and has been widely regarded as a bad move. I don't think this creation is just the material universe and the immaterium. Obviously, anyone who's seen my blog or anything like that would know that the notion that the Warhammer cosmology is just only the warp and the materium is a myth, but it's outright confirmed in the Winds of Magic book for 3E Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So the material universe that was made here, alongside the non-corrupted Sea of Souls, is what I believe to be the prime reality that Ahriman talks about in Ahriman Eternal. What Ahriman postulates in these quotes is that because the warp is so much bigger than the materium cannot be the quote-unquote prime reality, and that there must be a reality that is superior to the warp instead of inferior to it. This is important because the warp, or the Sea of Souls, is meant to be equal to the materium, growing alongside it, per Malkador in The End of the Death, where he calls it an absolute law of cosmic regulation. This notion of a proper real space warp balance is also told to us in The Path of the Dark Eldar. So presumably the Old Ones existed in this first universe, where the warp was in balance, like all things should be, instead of the warp overtaking the materium like it has in the current canon. Of course, it could have come from some other universe around the same time or something like that, but I think it's more fitting with their gimmick to be from this first prime reality. Although there is a statement about a god war, or more specifically a Titan Maki, that occurred before the first star was lit. This could imply that there was another generation of gods that fought the Old Ones, if we take what that word means to its absolute limit. But what did our titular frogmen do within this prime reality? Cocaine and hookers. No, but seriously, they cataloged everything. This presumably was to help them decode the Enuncia, which needs to be decoded to some extent, as we see within Mortis with the whole Tower of Babel subplot, and in the Heresy Black Book, where it is described as the ever-changing axiom. We have been told that the Old Ones are old slan, because the Old Ones were effectively just slan. Like, even in recent times when we got a statue of an Old One, it just looked like a slan. The pretending the slan and the Old Ones were like radically different. It's just a modern obfuscation thing that people like. They like to pretend like we know nothing about the Old Ones and stuff like that. It's really weird. Anyways, the frogs were masters of space and time, but more importantly, they viewed science and philosophy as the same, along with mastering these things. The point is that they had this mastery of creation beyond the materium and immaterium, i.e., the potential. Now you may be thinking, well sure, they had some OP power, but we have been told that the Enuncia is just the language of the Old Ones. This all leads into the big reveal that the Enuncia is just manipulating the potential, per this quote from Betrayer. In this quote, Lorgar basically describes the potential and uses a word of the Enuncia, like it's very blatant. I think this notion is consistent with the initial quote from Realms of Sorcery, since it literally says words that bind all things into conception. In Inferno issue 45, where we are told the reason magicians use words to cast spells in fantasy is because the Aether requires its opposite, the natural world, to realize the potential it was born from. We are also told in the same issue that you must create flawless conceptual traps of language to use spells, and the language you use to do this, of course, is derived from the Old Ones. We are also told that the Old Ones were the first race to fully quantify every thought and process in the materium and the immaterium. This does beg into question if there truly was a race before the Old Ones that they had to fight or something like that. The Old Ones having to quantify everything is also talked about in Realms of Sorcery, where we learn that it could describe every concept in creation regardless of temporality. Being independent of temporality is also consistent, since this language is what the true names are made of. This revelation now means that any use of a demon's true name is now a usage of the Enuncia. To the people who swore up and down that the Enuncia was just in the Abnet verse, R.I.P. Bozo, it's over. With this Enuncia tangent over, I now need to cover a completely different issue, that being time. In real life, we are used to a linear progression of things, but when it comes to the warp and things logically beyond it, we are not so lucky. So within a normal universe, time is pretty simple, right? Event A, then event B, then event C. So A is before C. But when we are dealing with universes linked via the warp, we can't just assume some kind of linear one-to-one flow. A day in fantasy might be 10,000 years in the 40k universe. Of course, there are universes that exist within the same membrane as each other, and they could totally have the same time flow in theory. However, the quote from Devastation of Baal implies they might not due to the dimension space in between universes having no time. There is still some way to keep track of what happened when, that being synchronicity. So during the end of the Siege of Terra, the whole plot is that there's going to be a fifth Chaos God that is fated to be born from humanity, as is the fate of all psychic species. But during the whole process, time is frozen, not allowing for the traditional scrying of the skeins of fate. Instead, our favorite sorcerer, Ahriman, explains that tarot cards are the way to divine the timeless future. This is relevant because the notion that the Chaos Gods, once born, always exist. So after the time stop ended, if a Chaos God was born, he would have had always existed. So we can say that Slaanesh, because he was born in 40k, that fantasy, and by virtue Age of Sigmar, must take place after the birth of Slaanesh. There are, of course, more complications with this. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know if the time flow has to be 1-to-1. So fantasy occurring over roughly 8,000 years doesn't inherently mean that the end of fantasy would be occurring concurrently with, say, M40 or something like that. After fantasy ends and Age of Sigmar begins, we are told that Sigmar was flung beyond time, making lining up a time frame even harder. This also makes it near impossible to disprove a connection between these games, because a true contradiction would require something happening at the same time, and we just have no way of lining it up. So Warhammer is cyclical in nature. Where order gets strong, chaos will eventually rise and overcome it, and when chaos gets strong, order will respond in kind. This is evident with this part of the quote from Realms of Sorcery, which I'm not going to reread. This isn't some one-off thing either. We are told about the cyclical nature of chaos numerous times. Of course, across the games, there are loads of statements about cycles and whatnot that all have the potential to be the endless potential, pun intended, but there are only a few I think directly play into it. A majority of them are coming from fantasy due to its special fate. So the universe of fantasy isn't just like any other universe. It has some specific fate in the grand scheme of things, which is verbatim stated in the Old World Core rulebook, where it lines out basically the end times. Like, it's pretty funny that they just lined it out there. I guess that was to stop people from saying that the Old World is going to retcon Age of Sigmar or something like that. This notion is also repeated in the 8th edition Lizardman Army book, where it stated that the world had endless potential, and thus was specifically sought out by the Old Ones. In Age of Sigmar, we would then be told about past cycles that occur, a common framing device being a turn of a universal wheel, or something like that. In 40k, especially during the end of the Heresy, we'd get quite a few mentions of a cycle, directly playing into this unifying idea of the cyclical potential. The last quote I want to talk about is this one from the 3rd edition Seraphon Army book, where it talks about how they want to end the cycle. What this actually means, though, is probably up to interpretation, considering there are numerous ways they could try to do this. So this is where we get into some speculation, since the stuff that happens before Fantasy's God War is spotty. To give time in terms of cycles, this is before chaos really existed at all, when the Sea of Souls was uncorrupted. So the Old Ones presumably created the Gods of Law at some point. As we see in Archives of the Empire 3, it is thought that the Gods of Law are so pure that only a reptilian brain could worship them. Hint, hint. I should note that the Gods of Law are warp gods, and they act just like the classical gods do within fantasy, and are outright stated to just have a realm in Liber Chaotica. What's really interesting about the Gods of Law is that if you look into them, you have Solkan, who's in opposition to Khorne, and Astasis, who represents purity of form in opposition to Tzeentch. So cool, there are two directly opposing gods. What's so interesting about that, Hashi? Well, I think this could be because Nurgle and Slaanesh hadn't been born yet. In non-linear terms, the cycle that would lead to Nurgle hasn't happened yet, and also the cycle that led to Slaanesh hadn't happened yet. So if this theory is correct, the Old Ones had their gods and tried to keep imposing order, or law, onto the Sea of Souls, and what sprung back was disorder, or chaos. If we take other evidence into account, presumably one universe had a species that birthed Khorne, and another that birthed Tzeentch. It could also be the opposite too, where Khorne was like a wake-up level 3 super, and the Old Ones had to respond. This would also tie into the whole thought weapon stuff we are told about with the Elven gods. Although that quote does posit that the Elven gods, more specifically Cain, is one of the first true gods of the Materium, although what that means is up to interpretation, of course. There's also an implication in the 3rd edition Necron Codex that the creation of these races with psychic potential and thought weapons may have played a hand in the warp going from the Sea of Souls to the chaotic hellscape that it is now. Eventually Nurgle would be born and then always exist. Like I said in the time section, if we say Nurgle was born in another universe, it could have happened at any time, as the time that passes in 40k doesn't have to pass in that other universe that connect to the same warp. I'm sure someone is going to retort that Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle were all also born in 40k alongside Slaanesh, but the quote from Rogue Trader that people use to say that doesn't actually say they were born during Earth's ancient history. It just says that they became fully conscious during it without specifying why. The quote then says what effects a fully conscious Chaos God had on humans. So now that we have the three Chaos Gods, we would then have the events of 40k's War in Heaven. I guess I should clarify, I specifically mean the war in heaven that resulted in the old ones in 40k being largely killed off, but I guess all of the wars in heaven kinda took place here. The 3rd edition Necron Codex seems to imply that during this war, the one that killed the old ones, is when the warp became stormy. It seems that some of the old ones were seemingly just stuck in 40k too, or maybe they chose to fight it out with the Necrons because they were scared the Necrons were going to lock them out with the pylons. A very real possibility. This would result in the old ones' projects within the 40k universe becoming foobarred, and eventually the occurrence of Slaanesh. I say occurrence because once Slaanesh existed, he, she, they, whatever, had always existed, per the End in the Death, and basically any Chaos Demons book where they clarify this. Now that we have the Pantheon of Chaos established, we can switch back over to fantasy. The fated universe with all the potential. Well, the life forms the old ones had cultivated had made their own gods. It all seemed well till the great game turned its focus to the old world of Warhammer Fantasy. It has been stated that if something piques the interest of the Pantheon, that in rare occasions they will all team up. We are told of this conflict in the 2nd edition, Tome of Salvation, where once the Great Gates collapsed, the Pantheon of Chaos tried to invade. The classical gods rose up and pushed them back into the realm of chaos, denying the dark gods from the old world for the time being. Now, what happens if you lose, you may be asking. So we can only really guess what happens when it's not some kind of a fated universe like fantasy is, but we have been told that chaos effectively eats the universe if there isn't anything to stop it, per 40k's rulebook. This also fits in with statements we have about 40k's universe falling into the warp and only being really stopped by the Necron pylons and of course the Emperor. We have also seen Nurgle digesting realities in Age of Sigmar, and realities floating around Tzeentch's head in the 40k Demons Codex. At this point, I'd assume any gods left die, presumably ending up in the Harrow Deep, or get absorbed, as we have seen Khorne has the rings of dead gods. There's also this whole desert of gods in the End in the Death. There's also the famous case of Slaanesh eating the Eldar gods. However, death is not the end for the Elven gods. So within the Warhammer mythos, the Elven gods have this very interesting gimmick, where they themselves are cyclical. We are shown that the Elven gods actively reincarnate with the cycles of the world. But we are also told in Liber Chaotica that the Eldar gods are thought weapons. This leads me to believe that the Elven gods are kind of molded by the Old Ones, or the Eldar, to fight in the God War and ideally retain power over the cycles in the event that they lose. The reason for this whole cyclical nature is that when chaos eats these realities and gods, it expands, thus destabilizing the cosmological order. This is in part why the conflict isn't between warp and anti-warp like the Catan, but rather law and chaos. For instance, we have been told that high magic is a force of creation, while chaos is of destruction. We are also told way back in Realm of Chaos that when law is ascendant, the polar storms in fantasy shrink. Within Warhammer, there are of course other myths out there. This isn't the only one. So for instance, there is this one from the Black Crusade core rulebook that suggests that chaos made the universe. I don't think this is out of character to be a myth in universe, however we should take into account that chaos is called the primordial annihilator for a reason. There's also the ever popular Well of Eternity, but I plan on covering that in its own video debunking the notion of the unknowable deep warp. Since this video is over, I'd like to clarify a few things. So as I went over a few times, this is not some comprehensive video essay, but rather just the essential facts required to assemble the creation myth. Secondly, I hope this video inspires others to look more into this stuff. The reason I'm making this video is sort of to pierce the veil of obfuscation the community has constructed. If one of you wonderful viewers wants to say read all the cursive in Liber Chaotica, render it into plain text, and then explain what that means in regards to the creation myth, that'd be really cool. And at the end of this video, if you're still crossing your arms and saying that none of this is valid because we aren't meant to know or something like that, I suggest you go to another channel, because I don't plan on bending a knee to this idea that we aren't supposed to know things. If it's in the text, it's in the text, and you can just cry about it. Anyways, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next video.